Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can follow me on YouTube. I'm on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, Podbean, a whole bunch of other podcatchers. And of course, I am rebroadcast later on Friday nights from, I believe it's 10 to midnight, although I should probably double check that, on a host of other networks, including Awake Radio, People's Internet Radio, PSN, Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel, and a few others as well. Well, I want to welcome all the listeners back and apologize for my somewhat summer hiatus. I know I was off for a couple of weeks from the show, but I am back now. I'm done with my summer vacation, which was quite enjoyable. But I did miss talking with all of you, so thank you for putting up with the sort of the absence of some new shows. I do want to just point out that there was lots of great material up on the website, including a really great interview I did with J.G. Michael for Parallax Views. It was a two-part show we did on Jeffrey Epstein, and it's a really great interview. Highly recommend that. There's lots of other stuff as well. I think I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second hour. But in the first hour, we are joined once again by a good friend and repeat guest journalist, Keelan Balderson from wideshut.co.uk. We're going to be talking about a new remastered documentary that Keelan did called the Chris Benoit Files, which you can find at WrestlePundit.com. It's been a while since I've been live on the air, I guess. But Keelan, how are you? It's good to be talking with you.
Good, man. Good to be back.
Excellent. Well, I guess I'll say this is definitely a departure from our usual topics of conversation. Keelan, you and I usually discuss terrorism, a lot of interesting jihadi groups linked to MI6 and others. We've spoken about Tommy Robinson and the rise of the right-wing groups within the United Kingdom. But we're totally switching gears a bit, talking about the former pro wrestler Chris Benoit, who was involved in a very brutal murder-suicide where he killed his wife, Nancy, his 7 or 8 year old son, Daniel, and then hung himself on some gym equipment. And this is, like I said, quite a departure. But I was happy to see that you were tweeting about the Chris Benoit Files, this documentary series that you did a few years back now for WrestlePundit.com, and you recently put it all together. And it is timely because I'm sure many of the listeners didn't know, but earlier in I believe it was June 24th marked the 10-year anniversary since Chris Benoit took his own life and the lives of his wife and son. So very interesting topic. There's a lot actually to unpack with all of this, and there is a much larger issue dealing with concussions and brain damage that we're going to get to later. But Keelan, I guess first and foremost, what made you make this film on Chris Benoit, and tell us a little bit about WrestlePundit.com.
Yeah, well, I've always been a pro wrestling fan, and actually I was sort of doing blogs and working for wrestling news sites before I even started anything with Wide Shut. And at the time that this happened back in 2007, as I say, I was kind of doing some of the wrestling news. So I did get to cover this, not firsthand as such, but I was sifting through the information and putting out updates on a few of the sites and stuff. And it's a brutal story, a fascinating story. But I kind of left it alone at that point. I thought, look, everything's out there. You know, there's nothing else really to go on with this. But about 6 or 7 years after that, I realized we've kind of got a whole generation of new fans to pro wrestling that don't really know what happened. And because the company WWE have it as a policy not to ever talk about the guy, he's kind of been brushed under the rug. And this void was kind of left where it got filled with a lot of sort of conspiracy theories, things like Kevin Sullivan, who was a wrestler who at one point sort of played a satanic gimmick. Oh, he did it because he divorced Chris's wife and things like that. A lot of the mainstream media kind of focused on steroids. So I thought, well, you know, I'll put something together. Started as a podcast, and then I quickly turned it into a video series. And then just recently, I mean, I did that in 2013, but just recently I put it all together into one file, and it seems to have been spread quite widely.
No, and it's an excellent documentary, especially in the full, you know, I believe it was like 5 parts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's nice to have it all together as, you know, one thing. It's about an hour long. Really good stuff. And I mean, full disclosure, I grew up a massive wrestling fan. And actually, you know, at the time when I was really into wrestling, I hated Chris Benoit. I thought he was, you know, super creepy and scary. I never liked him. And, you know, and then I sort of just stopped following wrestling. And then I remember when this all happened, you know, it was like came rushing back to me. And it's interesting you were just mentioning there, this whole new generation. You know, I mean, wrestling now is more popular than it's ever been. It's like a massive following. Actually, a ton of my friends started following it fairly recently and are super into it. And actually, I have a good friend who works for WWE as well, mainly on the marketing side. You know, not involved in the wrestling or anything like that. But so I've seen some recent pay-per-views. I haven't gone, but I've had chances to go to some of the live shows and stuff like that. And it's crazy, like the level to which it's sort of gone right now, where it is. It's like one of the, you know, the most watched shows on Mondays and Thursdays. You've got more and more, like people like Ronda Rousey entering into the world of wrestling. And as you said, Keelan, the entire history of Benoit has been essentially, I mean, it's not even like whitewashed. It's like it never even happened. He like doesn't exist in this world. There's no mention of him. And, for people that, you know, are unaware, and we'll get to it a bit later, I mean, wrestling, the amount of deaths in wrestling is staggering when you compare it to professional sports or just entertainment in general. The amount of people within the wrestling community that are dying either of, like, you know, crazy things like murder, but suicide, drug overdose. There's a whole myriad of health problems and stuff. So there is this like kind of darker side to all of this, and we'll explore that. But I guess, Keelan, for the listeners out there that may be unfamiliar, explain what transpired back on June 24th. This is a crime that actually took place over several days. I believe it's 3 days in total. But give the listeners an idea of what happened.
So Chris Benoit, obviously wrestling's a pretty grueling schedule. They barely get any time off. And he was scheduled for a live event, I think it would have been both on the Friday and the Saturday. And he no-showed those events. So there was already kind of, you know, where is this guy? Because Chris Benoit was one of those people that he didn't miss events. He was very loyal, almost prided himself on kind of his in-ring work and the dedication that he gave to this. And he missed those shows. And basically over the span of 3 days, he murdered his wife to start with on the Friday, or at least, the timeline's not exact, but it spanned over 3 days. He killed his wife first. She was bound, and basically asphyxiated. Then he sedated his young son with, I think, like an opiate, and then smothered him in his sleep. And then, as you said at the start there, he hung himself on some weight equipment. I think he actually set it up so it would actually break his neck.
Yeah.
And then hung himself that way. And, there you go. And it's pretty shocking stuff, really. But that's the nutshell of what happened.
Very brutal. A lot of bizarre, like the coverage of it became even more sensational. I think we'll talk about it a little bit later on. But a lot of misreporting, a lot of bogus stories. These crazy stories like that Benoit used his wrestling move, his signature move on his son, which you debunk entirely in the documentary in the Chris Benoit Files. How it doesn't even make sense. The reporting of it is like they had to know it was false, but they were running with the story anyway. And that is like a theme that kind of goes on throughout with the media coverage. And I didn't really know this until I was watching your film, Keelan, but Fox News was obsessed with this. It seems like Hannity was talking about this case every other night. Geraldo was obsessed with this. Very interesting. The outlets that picked this up. But I wanted to, there's two, very widespread conspiracy theories that if, anyone is somewhat familiar with this, they're probably familiar with these two things. And I just wanted to tackle them early on, and then we'll really kind of get into the heart of this. But talk about the mysterious Wikipedia entry, and also about Kevin, the Satanist Sullivan.
Right, yeah. So with Wikipedia, what happened was somebody edited Chris Benoit's Wikipedia page on the Sunday evening into the sort of early hours of Monday. And so there was a big pay-per-view event on the Sunday that he was supposed to appear at. That's the day that he hung himself. And somehow somebody managed to edit Wikipedia and said Chris Benoit missed the Vengeance pay-per-view due to the death of his wife. And obviously on the face of that, that's wow. How did somebody figure this out, or did they know in advance, or whatever? But when you dig a little deeper, it's just one of those sort of conspiracy side roads that people go down. It turns out that he'd already informed the company that his family had food poisoning. So this kind of, I guess maybe he was going for a cover story at one point and went that way with it. But he did inform the WWE management that his family was sick. They were in the hospital. And when somebody who's a big star no-shows a pay-per-view event, there's always a lot of speculation online. The websites will obviously cover it. Anyone who's watching the pay-per-view will have seen that he didn't show up and would be online discussing it. And this guy who edited this page did go back onto Wiki News and said, look, sorry for doing this. I didn't realize, after this all came out, I didn't really realize what I was doing. I was just reading some speculation, and I went up and changed this information. There's no reason why I did it. And actually, if you go back through this guy's Wikipedia history, he kind of had a track record of messing about with wrestlers' pages, just adding nonsense to them. So it's not really beyond the realm for him to just come up with something random like that and kind of a third hitting the spot, but not really. I mean, if we want to say if this guy was actually involved in the crimes and it was some kind of conspiracy or whatever, why would he go on Wikipedia and reveal that? Why
didn't he talk about Daniel being murdered?
Right, yeah, he didn't even get all the information correct. So, and the police did take him in. They seized his computer. They had a look. He didn't have any links to the Benoit family. He didn't sort of talk with anyone about this. It was just sort of a random thing that he decided to do after watching the event. And I mean, I'm happy with that. I mean, other people might think it's a bit peculiar. It is a little bit weird, but It's just one of those things. If you haven't got anything extra to add to that, then what really does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. And, right. I mean, I'm sure people will, tell us that we're totally wrong, but, there's nothing else to it, like you said. And if there isn't, then you kind of just have to move on.
I mean, it's very possible that at that time, somebody, I don't know, like a Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer, did get some kind of information. Oh, Benoit wasn't there because his wife was sick, and that might have filtered through the wrestling sites and whatever. I've not confirmed that actually happened, but that stuff does happen. So,
That was my sense, that this was really just, rumors, cause he had, up until this point, he'd also told another, wrestler and close friend of his, Chavo Guerrero. He actually spoke on the phone with Guerrero probably after he had murdered at least Nancy. And he stated that, he had a rough weekend, that they had food poisoning, he was in the hospital. So, he could have mentioned that to someone who, people gossip. It is at the end of the day, this is entertainment. People gossip in entertainment. So it's not inconceivable that this kid hears a rumor. There's also the whole Kevin the Satanist Sullivan, and I don't even want to go too far into this. This was a wrestler who was, part of this sort of Satanist wrestling, crew in the 1980s. Nancy Benoit was a member of this, and, people have speculated that he killed, the three of them and made it look like a murder-suicide because, I don't know, a few decades earlier, she had left him for Chris Benoit, which is kind of crazy to hold a grudge for that long. But maybe we can skip a lot of the specifics here, by just sort of jumping to who is the guy that is actually promoting this theory? Because he, when you reveal who the hell Johnny Angel is, it kind of just makes you really question anyone that buys into this theory. So who is Johnny Angel, the guy that is propagating this theory?
Yeah, it is quite funny. Like when you trace back most of this Chris Benoit conspiracy theory stuff, it goes back to this guy's website, this guy called Johnny Angel. His real name's Johnny Lee Clary. He was a wrestler, but I use that term lightly, like he had the shortest, most insignificant career possible. Yeah. Even if there's websites that track every single match that ever happened, and he's not even on any of that. So he's just sort of like this random guy that maybe wrestled a couple of times. And he never actually met Kevin Sullivan, who was married to Nancy at one time. He never met them. He doesn't know them personally. He just wrote this sort of short, superficial blog really saying that, an inside source told me that Kevin Sullivan is a high-ranking member of the Satanic Church, and he did this because he wanted his revenge. And it's like, well, if you mean the Satanic Church as in, Anton LaVey, then that's, who cares? Like that's not, then they don't sacrifice people. It's just a sort of, it's just a version of atheism that trolls Christians, really. It's not, it's not like it's not a banned group. It's not a criminal group. Nothing's ever really been linked to them. So who cares if he was a high-ranking member of the Satanic Church? But he himself denies that he is. And when you go look at his gimmick from the 80s, it was a thoroughly entertaining gimmick, probably a bit ahead of its time, to be honest. It was darker then than what he did in the 90s. But it wasn't, there was no consistency to it. He wasn't following like a written satanic doctrine or anything. He was just pulling sort of tropes from horror films and stuff. So to use that as evidence to these Satanists is a bit daft, really. But Johnny Angel himself, it's funny because this guy, was a national spokesman for the KKK. And, like throughout the 90s, he just seems to be one of these people that likes publicity. So like throughout the 90s, he was on all the sort of chat shows being the go-to person for the KKK. And he'd be on like Morton Downey Jr. And they'd throw him off, and he'd be on Oprah Winfrey. And then all of a sudden he sort of has a a crisis of conscience and turns to God, and then loads of schools were booking him for like motivational speaking and just a load of nonsense really. But this is the guy that spread this theory that Kevin Sullivan, the Satanist, killed Chris Benoit. And just on the face of it, it's fairly obvious that if he was genuine in that belief, it just really stems from the fact that he was, you know, a fundamentalist Christian, and he decided that, oh, well, this guy was a Satanist, so he must have done it. Just the sort of, you know, just nonsense, really.
Entirely. And it'd be interesting to see, you know, if he had remained, a Klansman, would he even be saying this, you know? Again, I suggest the listeners go and watch Keelan's film because you go into more detail about that. But I just wanted to address those two quickly because those are the two big ones. Very, very quickly. Interesting though, you know, there are some other aspects of the case, not necessarily suggesting that there was something more to this. I do genuinely believe Benoit did this himself. He killed his wife and son and then took his own life. But there does seem to be some evidence suggesting that WWE knew about this before it was publicly known. That they might have actually, you know, you point to I believe it was one of his Benoit's neighbors who was told by the police. This is crazy. I didn't even know that they would do this. They, you know, no one has seen him for days. He's left these bizarre voicemails on two wrestler friends of his on their cell phones that don't make any sense, talking about the dogs being locked up by the pool. Very strange. And then the cops they report him. They report this to the police. The police in the local area tell his neighbor to go check on him, which seems insane. She then does check on them, finds the bodies, runs out screaming, and she states that she saw another wrestler in like just outside his house. So, you know, and that's never really been looked into. I believe his name is Dave Taylor, and you know, you point out there are a few moments where it seems like the WWE might have known, or some people within the organization might have known what this was, because we should keep in mind there was a memorial service for Benoit live on television, like that.
Yeah.
You know.
So basically, so on Sundays they have the big events, and then Monday they have the television show Monday Night Raw, and they obviously realized by the Monday morning that, hang on, where is this guy? Something's gone wrong here. So they call the police and say, look, we need a welfare check on this guy. We're not sure what's going on. He said his family had food poisoning. We've had these weird text messages. Can you go check on him? And instead of the police doing it themselves, they asked the neighbor to just sort of go knock on the door and see what's happening. And she obviously goes and she discovers the bodies and is obviously freaked out. And on her way out of the property, she bumps into Dave Taylor, who at the time he was off the road from WWE, but he was still under contract. But he lived nearby basically. And he was walking up to the property with like a platter of deli foods. And the theory is, or at least this was put forth by someone who's been harsh on wrestling for decades, someone called Phil Mushnick. He puts forth the idea that WWE probably sensed that something bad had happened. And they obviously called the police to get it sorted out, but they wanted a pair of eyes there to sort of get all the information and get it straight back to them. And that's what Dave Taylor was doing. He's there with a platter of deli food. Maybe, he's his friend. He thinks they're sick. He's just turning up to say, look, are you guys all right? Here's some food. Hope everyone's doing okay. Look after yourselves, whatever. But they scheduled this memorial show on the Monday, showing his greatest hits, his matches, and they do this. WWE is bizarre. They always like to milk the emotion of even tragedy. Like they have all the wrestlers sort of on screen telling their stories about Chris.
Testimonials and
yeah, like blubbering up and crying, and it's very bizarre. But at some point, I think along that timeline, they realized something bad had happened and that Chris probably did this, and it probably got out that this was a double murder suicide. But they'd already put all the energy into having a memorial show, so they just went ahead with it anyway. And perhaps also because they don't want the negative publicity that would have come out if they sort of switched things up and said, oh, look, Chris killed everyone. We don't know what to do now. So they went ahead with that show. And as I said, yeah, a few of the wrestlers were on camera sort of giving their retrospective of Chris's career. And a lot of them were very like, oh, Chris was a great guy. I used to leave my kids with him. He was an awesome guy. But William Regal, who's another wrestler, he was quite close to Chris Benoit. He just wouldn't elaborate on everything. He was just like, he was a great wrestler, but I'm not going to comment anymore at this time. And I think if you think about it, there probably was a feeling that they knew what happened, but they went ahead with this anyway. So that's really the only sort of conspiracy theory. I mean, it's not really, it's not like someone else did it or anything, but there's just a bit of murky information there.
Mm. Well, and it's interesting too, this idea that they had, that maybe they knew that he had done this, that Chris Benoit had killed his wife and son and then killed himself. And, a lot of, in these close people, like, you point to William Regal as someone that was close with Benoit, who, was very cagey during this tribute. And it does make me wonder if, they didn't suspect something was off because, in the weeks leading up to this, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. And this is like from, members of his family, from his wife's family that, attested to this. And this seems to be a direct result of a degenerative brain disease that Benoit absolutely had. And I know that a lot of the media wanted to go to this whole roid rage thing. And again, without getting into the scientific details and the specifics of this, you can watch Keelan's documentary. There really is actually no evidence, really actually scientific evidence that roid rage even exists. And there's actually a lot of evidence to point that, taking testosterone actually mellows a lot of men. So, take that however you want. And I'll just say, as someone that is obsessed with cycling, professional cycling, back in the 80s and 90s and in the 2000s, every single cyclist was doping with testosterone. And they, and that's a huge, like, you could just look at that as a subset, as a whole thing where all these guys were taking human growth hormones, they're taking EPO, they're taking testosterone. They didn't all end up brutally murdering anyone, as far as I know so, you can take that as an example that, because I know that people kind of, the wrestlers, they're taking steroids, they're all buff, they go crazy, but roid rage doesn't really exist. There isn't any evidence that actually points to this. Whereas
I think if you look at the crime itself, roid rage, whatever it may or may not be, is a momentary snap of anger. It's my hormones are all out of whack. Something's annoyed me. I'm just going to punch the wall or something. This was a crime that spanned 3 days. There was a lot of sort of at least initial planning involved. Like Nancy was tied up. This wasn't he didn't just randomly attack her. Like she was tied up. He placed Bibles beside them. There was a sort of suicide note that was left where he'd written that he was depressed. He's planning to leave this earth, things like that. And it spanned 3 days. So that's not rage. That's not like he did all that in a fit of rage. That's something a bit more deeper psychologically, I think. So like, regardless of whether roid rage is even real or not, it wasn't roid rage. That's just not what it was.
No, and conveniently, Fox News and others would obsessively talk about roid rage, for weeks on end after the murder happened. But they would never talk about the fact that Benoit also had Vicodin, Xanax, and alcohol in his body. From toxicology reports, which is definitely an extreme combo to be taking. On top of his traumatic brain injury. And let's talk about this, Keelan, because this is sort of like the heart of the film. I mean, where you really kind of break this down and you get past the media hype and you get into some actual scientific facts. Benoit's brain was studied afterwards by the Sports Legacy Institution. And, tell the listeners, what did they find when they examined Benoit's brain?
Yeah, so like you said, after he died, the group's called the Concussion Legacy Foundation now, but back then it was the Sports Legacy Institute. And, they took his brain out and they did extensive tests on it, and it showed the same sort of amount of degeneration as an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Now people have took that and sort of brushed it aside, like, oh, are you serious? An 85-year-old Alzheimer's? How did he get to the arena? How was he sort of talking to people? I think people are misunderstanding what they meant by that. They're not saying he had the exact same symptoms of a elderly Alzheimer's patient. They're just saying that his brain had deteriorated to a similar degree. It's a different condition, obviously. And CTE, it causes depression, causes mood swings, memory lapses, just all sorts of cognitive issues. And people say, how did he get to the arena? He actually was struggling with a lot of things. Nancy Benoit's sister said that, he was that paranoid and got into weird obsessive loops that he would sort of, if he'd go to the airport one way one week, he would have to go a different way the next week because he thought someone was following him, and he would plan out all these sort of detailed routes of how he would get to the airport, and he would do the same going to the gym and stuff. So that there's clear signs there that he was just not functioning properly. And he'd previously confided in the founder of the Sports Legacy Institute, Chris Nowinski, who himself was a wrestler who had to retire. He retired of his own accord. If he wanted to carry on, they would have let him. But he retired of his own accord because he was having these post-concussion symptoms. And he talked to Benoit, and Benoit said, look, I'm missing this chunk of time. I'm having memory problems. And I mentioned earlier that he had a suicide note that mentioned a lot of this kind of depression and issues. So, it's apparent that he was sort of on a downward spiral. And I think his closest friends have sort of confirmed that. And as I say, Nancy Benoit's sister. It's not too far of a stretch to imagine that this was a large contributor to what happened. It's a horrible, horrible tragedy, but he was suffering from some pretty messed up stuff.
Well, we should point out too that and CTE, for people who don't know, is Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy. I can't pronounce it.
Something like that.
Yeah, but this is CTE is a big one that we see here in America in the NFL. We see, the whole CTE problem has become somewhat more spoken about. And this comes from concussions. And you cite a few, NFL stars who did, exactly what Benoit did. Killed a loved one and then killed themselves. That's not isolated either. People suffering from CTE can act out like this, and there's a couple of high-profile cases. I can't remember the player's name off the top of my head, but I think he played for Kansas City, and murdered his girlfriend, and then drove to the stadium and shot himself in his car. There was jump in.
Yeah, and there was this other guy. I think his name was Justin Strelzek, who basically had a full sort of schizophrenic breakdown, thought he was hearing devil voices, went on just a high speed random drive up the highway and went headfirst into a lorry and died. So, these things, have sort of started to show themselves in all sorts of different sports where concussions are a common thing. And I think it's interesting, like in this country we have rugby and there's none of this. And it's because in American football, they're all geared up and padded and they've got their helmets on. But that's just kind of a superficial, it looks like they're protected, but they're really not. They're going full pelt head first into each other and rattling their brains around. And it's kind of funny that in sports where you have less protection, you're obviously less likely to go full pelt and they don't actually have these problems. But yeah, like it's become a pretty well established thing now in the NFL that CTE is a major problem. And even just not always, there's a lot of suicide. Suicide seems to be the main thing. There was a wrestler called Andrew Martin who wrestled as Test. He overdosed on prescription drugs and they studied his brain and he had CTE. And now a lot of wrestlers have pledged to sort of donate their brains to science so they can study this. But yeah, just a lot of incidents can be traced back to CTE. Even football players that retire and they turn to gambling or they just have meltdowns in other ways, maybe that's part of it too.
Oh yeah, there was I think there was another football player you mentioned in the documentary who I believe before in his suicide note he said he wanted his brain to be studied because he knew there was something wrong stemming from massive concussions. Because I mean the big problem, or something that really exacerbates CTE or that can cause that, is also these guys are getting concussions, be it in an NFL game or in the wrestling ring, and they continue fighting or playing. They're not. There's no like again. I mean, and anyone that's seen any kind of professional wrestling, I mean, these dudes are taking metal chairs to the face. They're jumping off, huge platforms head first. They're slamming into things. There's no like doctor on the side saying, "Oh, well, hold on, let's just do a concussion check." I mean, they've begun to implement those in the NFL. But even that, I have my questions about how accurate that is or how much they're really doing. I mean, again, it's also like if the player seems, more or less okay, I think they will let him go on,
Well, that's always been the funny thing in wrestling. It's a show. It's not real. They're not intentionally trying to hurt each other and,
right.
The outcome's predetermined. But actually, traditionally, I mean, it's a bit different now, but historically, if you got hurt seriously in a pro wrestling match, you carried on and pretended that you weren't hurt. Whereas in like other contact sports, that's the end of it. So,
yeah, exactly.
It's
like
kind of ironic.
Yeah. No, it's like I mean, if right, exactly. If this was rugby, let's say, and, your arm is broken, you don't keep going. Whereas in professional wrestling, no, play through the pain. Just bite your lip and, carry on, say your lines, and then walk off. Which is crazy.
And Chris Benoit was of a generation where they were on the road 300 days a year, performing every single night. And it was almost a sort of a badge of honor to work hurt and work through the pain and show that you're loyal and you can do it. And also Benoit, he was a smaller guy in the wrestling business. And a lot of those smaller guys that didn't get the attention on them because they just looked giant and they had a cool catchphrase and they looked like a superstar. A lot of those guys that never found their way into the main event, their whole thing became, well, I'm going to leave 110% in the ring. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to make it seem as brutal as possible. And that was their way of getting noticed. And he kind of came up through that era where that's what you had to do. You really had to sort of push yourself to limits that no one should really have to go to get noticed. And eventually, towards the end of his career, he was given the world title. He was put in the main event picture. And it was rewarding him for that style of wrestling that really is what caused his downfall.
And Keelan, I mean, I mentioned before that perhaps some within the WWE recognized that there was something off. I mean, do you have anything to add in terms of that? I mean, were there? Probably they wouldn't let us know. I mean, this is such a massive. I mean, it's like $1 billion industry now. They're huge. The merchandise alone probably makes them a small fortune. But I mean, was it because I know that to some extent with the NFL, they were aware of this. There were people saying, these guys something is happening to these guys' brains. The concussions are having a really negative, long-lasting effect. And the NFL was basically tried to hush it up. Is there any evidence that the WWE was aware of this? I mean, because they were definitely aware of the drug use that was going on. And, a lot of these guys were hooked on painkillers, because they truly were in an insane amount of pain. But other things too. I mean, you had guys abusing coke, definitely alcohol. I mean, was there any evidence that they were aware of, things like CTE?
I don't think to the degree that we know now in terms of like the raw science of it, but I think, there's an element of common sense there. Like you get hit in the head with a metal chair, and you're in pain and you've got a headache and you feel like you want to throw up and you're going to another town and you're doing it all again. Like I think it was just sort of, we're just going to brush this under the rug. I mean, there's no evidence that they knew the extent of the damage that was being done necessarily, but I don't think you can deny. No, everyone knows not to like run your head into a set of metal stairs or whatever. So, there's been a lot of lawsuits since all this came out of wrestlers kind of claiming, look, I had concussions, they made me wrestle, all this kind of thing, but none of them have ever stuck because there's no hard evidence that, as a policy, they were forcing these guys, to wrestle when they knew that they had a CTE. I mean, no one really knew what CTE was, so none of that's ever really stuck. But, Vince McMahon knew that a lot of these guys were in pain, were on downward spirals. I think he just left it until he had to deal with it. That's kind of been his thing the whole time. Even recently, they're doing this thing now called the Women's Revolution, where, in prior years, prior decades, the whole point of women on wrestling was just to, eye candy. Yeah. And now they're letting the actual talented female wrestlers actually wrestle and they're kind of hyping that. But again, it's just WWE going which way the wind blows. They'll just do what they can get away with and they'll just market what's marketable, I think. So as much as there has been a lot of changes for the better, I think it's really just because they were forced to, not because that's what they wanted to do, if you know what I mean.
Mm. Oh, yeah. McMahon seems really just driven almost exclusively by money. And that's why he, buys up any and all competition to the WWE. I think, he, I'm not trying to knock his, business prowess, because he certainly is quite savvy. And obviously, he gets people to watch over and over. Nobody buys pay-per-view anymore except for wrestling and to a lesser extent boxing, in UFC. But, he's people will still shell out a considerable amount of money to watch these things. So, he obviously, he has this product that people want. But yeah, it seems like, very much like he will just sort of push it, until you have to do something. Which seems to be, like the thing with Benoit. And then, like you said, talk a little bit about some of the reforms that they've put into place in the aftermath of the Benoit case.
Yeah, so they did have the drug testing shortly before Benoit did all this, because another wrestler, high-profile wrestler, Eddie Guerrero, died. He had a heart attack, and that was basically linked to past steroid abuse because his heart enlarged. Which is what, it's a muscle too. So you enlarge everything basically in the end if you abuse steroids for a long period of time. And he also took a lot of painkillers in his day, which also sort of put stress on the heart. He was clean when he died, but, he had a heart attack young. And so they put drug testing in place, but it was always like, are they really doing it or whatever? Then this Benoit thing happens, and you get the sense that, maybe this thing wasn't legitimate. Maybe they weren't really testing them. So they did put in a pretty stringent, complete wellness policy. They test their cardio health. They're drug tested, all forms of drugs, even for a while. Marijuana was on that list. Now that they've lapsed that a little bit. But, they've also introduced like proper concussion testing now. If they get a concussion now, they're off until they've passed tests and they can come back, and that can be weeks, that can be months. One wrestler called Daniel Bryan, essentially retired. He came back now, but it's been like a number of years. So they are kind of taking that seriously. But still, they're still on the road. They still barely have any time off. It's still a very, very, physical sport. And I think, physical show. And I think now the style is starting to morph into sort of a more athletic and physical style, because a lot of the younger, more athletic guys are getting their way to the top of the industry. So I wonder whether that will come back to bite them in the future. But like in terms of the testing, it's fairly stringent, at the moment. But again, they still don't really get that time off that they need. And they could easily do an off season. They've got thousands and thousands of hours of content that they could throw out there. They don't need to have all these guys on the road for this long.
No, I agree. And I'll link this back in an odd way again to cycling, because the cycling season is almost a year long. I mean, for a lot of these guys, it can start as early as January. It'll end sometime in late October, and then it'll start up again in January. The cycling season has become more and more just insane in terms of how many races there are. And and in a similar way, cyclists are very, the same thing, play through the pain all the time. I mean, these guys will, you'll see a guy finish a stage in the Tour or the Giro with broken collarbone, blood everywhere, and then they'll get out the next day and race again and again and again. And the same thing with they are now implementing concussion testing to a degree within cycling, but it's not like in the moment. If a guy has a horrific crash and seems a little bit like wobbly, you'll see them they'll have a horrifying crash. They'll be stumbling on their feet, but then they get back up on the bike and they finish the stage. And sometimes it might be 4 or 5 hours later, when the stage is done and they get, out of the press area and back to the team bus, that they're actually getting a concussion test. And, it seems like at that point the damage has got to be done. I mean, it's difficult, I guess, in a sport like cycling where you just have to keep going in a race, and also in something like wrestling where it's like they can't break the fourth wall and be like, wait, hold on. I don't know. It's scary because I think there's also going to be a generation. I mean, Benoit might have been a bit early, and I'd like to get your take on this, Keelan, but a generation of athletes, entertainers that are really going to be suffering from CTE in ways that we haven't really fully understood. I mean, we've seen bits and pieces here and there within the NFL and also within wrestling, but I mean, there's a lot of other sports where you're getting hit in the head more than you'd think. And even if you're wearing a helmet or something, it's not doing that much. I mean, what do you think in terms of the legacy of the sort of brain injuries? Because again, I mean, listen, it gets talked about in the NFL. They say we're doing concussion testing. Nobody cares. Now it's oh my God, they're kneeling. Or Colin Kaepernick's a Marxist or something. Whereas no one is really looking at the long-term health effects. I mean, what do you think, Keelan? I
think it's definitely going to take maybe another decade or so, but I think it probably is moving in the right direction. Like I said, there's a lot of wrestlers now. I'm not too sure how the NFL does all this, but there's been a ton of wrestlers that have signed up to donate their brains to science. So eventually the data is just going to keep adding up. And I mean, you mentioned there about different contact sports, even just children playing soccer and heading the ball.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even that's come out as being dangerous to the brain, because obviously that ball is not light. It's just thing whacking you in the head, and you've got kids doing that. So, you know, there's been sort of small campaigns to try and eradicate heading the ball until you're a certain age and things like that. So I think gradually these things are going to be put into place. But I also think we're probably going to reach a point where we just have to say any kind of contact sport is going to cause some damage. Are we okay with that or aren't we? You know, we're just going to have to make that decision. Perhaps retire a lot earlier or something of that nature. But I don't think there's any way of getting around it that all these sports do damage, and maybe that comes down to a parenting thing. I don't know, but it's something that society will have to face in the next decade or so.
No, and it is. I know. I mean, there's a. I don't know if you've seen the South Park episode with Sarcastoball. You know, where all of these fears of head injury and stuff. But I mean, it is real. Yeah, I know it's I've heard about the whole thing with soccer. I mean, again, too, a little tiny kid playing soccer. I mean, their brain just isn't developed. Their heads are softer than, you know, like maybe a grown adult. And this is like, you know, I don't know, maybe a little bit comical, but you know, Curly from the Three Stooges. He really did. He suffered severe head injuries, from getting bonked on the head all the time. That did eventually, you know, he had serious health problems later in life, but, you know, he suffered from these like kind of long-term concussion problems where he had terrible headaches all the time. You know, he had a bunch of other health issues, but even something like that where it's like, it's a movie. You know, it's not supposed to be real. No, they really were hitting him in the head all the time. And, you know, he suffered for it. And it's, I don't know, it's an odd topic. Like you said, I mean, are we gonna say, it's fine to get concussions, you know, like in every contact sport? I mean, is that just something we're gonna live with? I mean, that's a crazy, it's a crazy notion, but at the same time, I mean, sport is, I mean, especially where you are, Keelan, I mean, in the UK, I mean, they're not going to just stop playing soccer, you know, or something, you know, if something comes out that, oh my God, you know, every time a ball hits your head, you know, I don't know, you lose so-and-so amount of like brain capacity or something. I mean, these are massive industries that are not going to end. But yeah, I don't know, there's a weird moral quandary. I've actually, aside from like all of the like just I hate the NFL for a variety of reasons, the concussion thing has actually made it more and more to the point I don't watch it at all. But that's really what's like keeping me from ever watching it again is like knowing that when these guys are getting slammed in the head, it's like they could be, you know, a few more concussions away from committing something like Chris Benoit did. And I
mean, I watch wrestling now, and at least WWE have toned down their style a bit in terms of like weapons and stuff like that. And sometimes I'm sitting there thinking, oh, this is boring. But then I'm like, well, actually, no, like maybe I don't want to see someone get hit with a chair. So yeah, it's a conundrum, you know, as fans, we pay for this kind of thing to carry on, but you know, do we take some blame in that? I don't really know.
Oh, well, I think that's even a question that you posed in the end of the film is, you know, how much is this also the fans want more and more violence? And there are like different, you know, there's like these smaller independent wrestling leagues around the United States that like pride themselves on being even more extreme. I mean, that's its own little niche industry where these guys are really, I mean, doing horrific things to one another in the ring, and it gets legal. But anyway, I want to thank my guest, Keelan Balderson. You can go to wideshut.co.uk to find more of his work, and I want everyone to stay tuned. We're going to be speaking with Daniel Kovalik all about Nicaragua in the second hour, so thank you so much.
Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
Practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Have you experienced the miracle of CBDs? They can help you reduce suffering, reduce stress, help you sleep better, modulate inflammation in the body, and is absolutely safe. Meta Hemp Solutions offers a radically innovative approach to CBDs for exceptional results. Stop suffering and reduce your stress now. Isn't it time for a good night's sleep? Stop worrying about tomorrow today. Lab tested for potency, purity, and is non-psychoactive. Free shipping to all 50 states. Try our product risk-free. Money-back guarantee. Use code AFR15 to get 15% off. That's Alpha Foxtrot Romeo 15 to get 15% off. Offer ends soon, so visit MetaHemp Solutions today at metahempsolutions.com or call 833-858-7500. Suffer no more. Get rid of the stress and sleep better. Get our product now at metahempsolutions.com. That's metahempsolutions.com.
When the weapons of mass destruction thing turned out not to be true, I expected the American people to rise up. They didn't. Then, when the Abu Ghraib torture thing surfaced and it was revealed that our government participated in rendition, a practice where we kidnap people and turn them over to regimes who specialize in torture, I was sure then the American people would be heard from. We stood mute. Then came the news that we jailed thousands of so-called terrorist suspects, locked them up without the right to a trial or even the right to confront their accusers. Certainly, we would never stand for that. We did. And now it's been discovered the executive branch has been conducting massive illegal domestic surveillance on its own citizens. You and me. And I at least consoled myself that finally, the American people will have had enough. Evidently, we haven't. In fact, if the people of this country have spoken the messages, we're okay with it all. Torture, warrantless search and seizures, illegal wiretappings, prison without a fair trial, or any trial, war on false pretenses. We as a citizenry are apparently not offended. There are no demonstrations on college campuses. In fact, there's no clear indication that young people even seem to notice. The Secret Service can now declare free speech zones to contain, control, and in effect, criminalize protest. If you have on a supportive t-shirt, you can be there. If you're wearing or carrying something in protest, you can be removed. This in the United States of America. This in the United States of America. Every time somebody disagrees with how the government is running things, he or she is labeled un-American. The tragedy of our day is the climate of fear in which we live, and fear breeds repression. It's far easier to fight for principles than to live up to them.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, rocket copy. 4, 3, 2, 1.
experience. American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can follow me, of course, right here on AFR, on my website through the RSS feed. You can follow me on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, and Podbean as well. So lots of ways to listen, of course, also on YouTube. And if you want to support my work, then you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond, and you can become a patron of mine and a subscriber for as little as $1 a month, which of course gives you access to the exclusive bonus podcast. And we recently had a really great conversation, once again with our friend, Professor Isa Bloomy, from Stockholm University, and we talked again about Yemen, but also Qatar and Turkey and some of the political situation going on in Turkey right now, and how that is also affecting Yemen and the larger sort of Middle Eastern region at the moment. So definitely check that out. I might even make that available for a brief period to all the listeners out there. You don't have to necessarily sign up to Patreon because it's a very important conversation. And very quickly, just two other brief plugs, and then we will get on with today's show. I just wanted to mention that the new episode of Open Minds on Air has been posted, and Yuval and I discussed the power of conspiracy theory, how it manipulates people. We talked about the QAnon theory as well. It's a very interesting episode over at Open Minds. And I hope people are enjoying the Open Minds Foundation podcast. And also, I just wanted to mention that I did 2 episodes, 2 hours, an hour each, for J.G. Michael's Parallax Views. And we talked extensively about the Jeffrey Epstein case. And I think it's probably like the best interview I've ever done, talking about Epstein and the history behind him. And we got into a lot of detail, including a recent meeting that Steve Bannon had at Epstein's townhouse here in New York. But so do check those out. But I want to welcome Professor Daniel Kovalik. I know I've probably just butchered his name once again, even though we went
that's
over
right.
it.
You nailed it.
Oh, okay, good. He is a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He is the author of a couple of books. One is The Plot to Scapegoat Russia and the Plot to Attack Iran. They are both out and available, and we will link up to those in the show notes, and I encourage people to check them out. And we are going to be talking about Nicaragua and perhaps also Venezuela. But Professor Daniel Kovalik, nice to have you on the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Is there anything, I know I gave you kind of like a rushed bio. Is there anything that you want to tell the listeners, who is Daniel Kovalik?
Well, I mean, for one, I would start that my political education really did begin in a serious way in Nicaragua when I was 19. I was there in 1987 in Ocotal, which was in a war zone on the Honduran border. And then I actually went back the next year, drove with the Veterans Peace Convoy to Nicaragua with humanitarian aid, which is an interesting story in and of itself. But my main focus has been, since that time, Latin America. And I have always seen Nicaragua as my first love, which I think is good background for our discussion today.
Well, absolutely. And Nicaragua is it's a topic that I haven't discussed too much on the show, although I did an episode a few months back. I'll link up to it, talking about this series of protests that began around Nicaragua, but certainly in the capital, in Managua, that have sort of spiraled out of control. There's definitely there's something more going on to these protests. It's widely reported in the Western media that, 300 people have been killed since the start of these anti-government protests. And there's been a lot of pressure against the current leader of Nicaragua, President Ortega. And, I just pulled up earlier today, Congress is pushing to essentially impose Iran-like sanctions on Nicaragua. They've already, they've gone after a few people within Daniel Ortega's administration. They want to do, I think some of his family members. This is, of course, being pushed by all the usual suspects when it comes to, U.S. imperialism in Latin America. So you've got Senator Robert Menendez, you've got Marco Rubio, a whole cast of characters that always have something to say about what's going on in Latin America. But Professor Kovalik, why don't you explain to the listeners a little bit what is actually going on in Nicaragua at the moment? Because if you were to just sort of look up if you Google Nicaragua, you will find a whole host of Western articles talking about, Daniel Ortega as this monster. He's a dictator. He's cracking down on, freedom and democracy. These, reports of death squads going around. And as I've said before, when I discuss Nicaragua, this is not really the full picture. So explain to the listeners what's been going on and what's going on right now at the moment.
Well, first of all, I think it's probably important to remind folks about a little history here, who Ortega is, how he came to be a leader in Nicaragua. It has to be noted that the U.S. installed the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua in the 1930s, a dictatorship that lasted until 1979, when the Sandinistas, led in part by Daniel Ortega, overthrew the Somoza dictatorship. This was a brutal dictatorship. About 50,000 Nicaraguans died in the late 70s fighting that dictatorship. And very quickly, the U.S., taking umbrage at the fact that their favorite dictator in the Americas was overthrown, they supported a very brutal war against Nicaragua, the Contra War, the leadership of the Contras being the former National Guardsmen of Somoza. That war was prosecuted until about 1990 with the support and organization of the United States. Another 30,000 to 50,000 Nicaraguans died in that war. During this time, Ortega, in 1984, was elected president in free and fair elections in Nicaragua during the Contra War. These were the first free and fair elections Nicaragua ever had in its history. By 1990, however, people were pretty exhausted with the war, and Ortega ends up being voted out of office. He steps down, and allows Violeta Chamorro to become president. Now, Ortega and the Sandinistas were out of power, at least in the presidency, from 1990 to 2007. In 2007, Ortega is inaugurated again as president. He won the 2006 presidential elections. And since 2007, when Ortega was sworn in as president, Nicaragua has had unprecedented economic growth between 4% and 5% every year since that time. There's been incredible gains in terms of literacy and poverty reduction that Ortega has led. And he really helped create one of the more stable countries in the region, certainly in Central America. And as late as October of last year, 2017, as a result of this, Ortega had 80% approval ratings. 80, with 8-0, which is pretty incredible, right?
Yes.
And not surprisingly, given what I just mentioned. Nicaragua also is the most equal society in the Americas. In fact, I just saw a National Geographic piece. Their latest details from 2017 listed Nicaragua as the most equal society in the Americas. So this is, these are not small feats for a country, for any country, but certainly one that went through years of U.S.-backed dictatorship and then a U.S.-backed war against it in the 80s. And this brings us to the present time. So all of a sudden, Ortega, who had these 80% approval ratings, is being portrayed as this dictator that needs to be relieved from office. Now, what did happen in this year, in April, mid-April, was that Ortega announced very modest changes to the Social Security system in Nicaragua in order to make sure that the Social Security system was solvent past 2019. If changes weren't made, the Social Security system would become bankrupt by 2019. The IMF was pushing very radical austerity measures to keep it solvent, which the business community supported. And Ortega rejected those and instead proposed much more modest changes, which slightly increased employee contributions to Social Security, increased employer contributions even more, and also provided actually a retiree health benefit, which wasn't there before. He announced those changes in mid-April, I think April 16th, and there were protests, initially peaceful protests, in response to the Social Security reforms that he had announced. And I think everyone agrees he didn't do a very good job laying the groundwork for these changes. People misunderstood what they were and what they could have been facing had business gotten its way. But in any case, so there were protests against the reforms that initially were peaceful. And the protest included, retirees, which makes some sense. And then students as well, which makes less sense given that these are Social Security reforms. Usually students aren't that interested in Social Security. And what happened is, it's clear to me that there were forces in Nicaragua, these right-wing opposition forces, who then hijacked these peaceful protests and began very violent demonstrations, which quickly moved from protesting Social Security reforms to calling for Ortega to step down as president. And essentially what ensued, in my view, was a mini civil war, really, that happened within a 3-month or so period in which this opposition, which was getting funding from the United States, they've gotten about $4 million of funding in the last 4 years from the National Endowment for Democracy, and then another 29 million or so from USAID. The more radical wing of this opposition began really engaging in criminal activities in the country, which included burning down various buildings, including a credit union, which I was recently in Nicaragua. I saw the burned out credit union, which had served the poor communities. That was leveled to the ground. They burned a progressive radio station called Radio Ja, which is the most actually popular radio station in Managua. They burned that to the ground with 22 people inside who just were able to get out of the radio station. And burned various other buildings throughout the country, attacked Sandinista cadre, and set up these things called, which became known as tranques, these barricades throughout Nicaragua, which really cut off travel and economic activity and really devastated the country economically. That part of the struggle, or that part of the events is ignored in the Western press. They don't talk about the violence that the right wing was committing during this time. And, so when you hear the figure, 300 people died during this period due to the protest, they lay all 300, the blame for all 300 people at the hands of Ortega, which is just totally not true. It doesn't take into account the Sandinistas who were killed by the right wing, police who were killed by the right wing, bystanders who were killed. It also, the numbers seem to be inflated a bit. That is that the 300 number seems to take into account people who died during this period who weren't killed as part of the demonstrations, but were killed for other reasons or in other ways. But in any case, this numbers game is played that tries to make it look like Ortega is committing, atrocities against his own people, which I don't believe to be the case. Meanwhile, there certainly were opposition people who were killed during this period. But again, and I think those people will be held to account, by the way. I think to the extent there were people who took, justice into their own hands and killed opposition folks, I think those people will be prosecuted, while the opposition folks who carried out violence and murders will also be held to account. Interestingly, the police forces in Nicaragua for years have been held up as a model for community law enforcement, and have received all kinds of awards for their work with the communities. And again, all of a sudden have been, labeled as, repressive, forces by the Western media. And again, I don't think that to be, the case, but that's essentially what has happened. Now, right before the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, which is July 19th, the last tranques were cleared in the town of Masaya, particularly the neighborhood of Monimbo, which became a real hotspot for these tranques and for the uprisings that happened. And things are largely returning to normal in Nicaragua. Things that have been destroyed are being rebuilt. The economy is being rebuilt by the government, and they're trying to restore tourism, which is a huge part of the Nicaraguan economy, which obviously took a huge beating during these months because of the violence and because of the press coverage. There are still limited, pockets of violence that are happening in Nicaragua, but largely things are returning to normal. And I think what happened, my sense of what happened, was that initially there were huge demonstrations early on against Ortega. People in Nicaragua were led to believe that the government was cracking down on peaceful protesters in a systemic way. And and there were huge protests against Ortega initially, many of which were aimed at asking either for him to step down or to agree to early elections. However, as time went on, it seems very apparent to me, and again, I was in Nicaragua in July, that most Nicaraguans started to realize that what they were being told wasn't true, that the government was not some tyrannical government, as was being claimed in the Western media and also by some media in Nicaragua. And that the people who were organizing these tranques throughout Nicaragua were not the friends of the people. They were not doing this to try to create some sort of progressive social change, but were there to destroy the economy and there to destroy the Sandinista movement. And people began to rally around the government and around Ortega. And in fact, when I was there, there was a song that went viral that was written by a mariachi group in Nicaragua called Daniel Sequeda, Daniel Stays. And the song goes, Daniel stays, Daniel, the people are with you. And this was a song that went viral throughout Nicaragua. People began to rally around Daniel Ortega. And by the time of a litmus test that everyone viewed as a litmus test was the 19th of July celebrations. So July 19th marks the anniversary of the Sandinista overthrow of Somoza. Every year there's huge rallies in support of the Sandinistas and is celebrating the Sandinista revolution. Everyone viewed these rallies this year as some sort of litmus test for where the Nicaraguans were at vis-a-vis the government. And I was there at the rally in Managua. And there was huge numbers turned out for that, about 300,000 people, in Managua. And there were rallies throughout the country as well, in addition to that. And it was very clear by those numbers, by the energy of the rallies. Again, I witnessed it in Managua, that people, the tide had turned in favor of Ortega and against the folks on the other side, particularly the violent folks organizing these barricades throughout Nicaragua. And again, this is not part of the story that you're hearing in the press. I think now the public sentiment is firmly on the side of Ortega. People want things to go back to normal. People want to go back to having a prosperous country with economic growth and tourism, though that's going to be elusive for a while. It's very clear, as one person told me, that this year is going to be a lost year economically. This 4 to 5% growth that's been seen since Ortega was elected for in 2007 is not going to be seen this year. There will probably be no GMP economic growth, and maybe there'll even be negative growth, shrinkage of the economy because of the events of the past few months. But the government's, really working hard to turn that situation around. And I think you will not see the, type of widespread unrest and violence that you did see in the past, between April 16th and the middle of July. I think you will see things calm down quite a bit.
Well, and I assume that that is the reason right now that the powers that be within the U.S. are pushing for all of these intense sanctions. Clearly, the protest movement did not achieve what I believe they hoped it would. So now they're taking the other route, which is to pretend to be targeting Daniel Ortega and his administration, but in reality, of course, these sanctions will actually be hurting the very people that Marco Rubio and others are pretending to be supporting, which is how most of these sanctions kind of pan out. And Daniel, I couldn't help but kind of make the comparison to another country, which I know you've written about, Iran, where a similar thing happened where, Rouhani introduced, these very neoliberal, economic, policies. And we saw widespread protests in Iran, which again were peaceful. They were completely, allowed. The government had no problem with them. And then bit by bit, we saw, shadowy, figures like the MEK seeming to, insert themselves into these protest movements. And then you start seeing cars being burned in Tehran and other major cities. Again, just like in Nicaragua, mysterious sniper attacks, which get blamed on the government, just like in Ukraine, just like in Iran, in Venezuela, obviously Nicaragua. And it really does seem to fit a very straightforward pattern in all of these countries. Again, it seems no surprise that these protests in Iran that, everyone here was predicting, this is it, this is the end of an era where, they're finally gonna throw off the shackles of this horrible government and, I guess bring about the second coming of the Shah. And then that quieted down and ended, and life went back to some normalcy. And now we're already seeing this sort of increased sanctions rhetoric with Iran and also with Nicaragua. And same thing. Nikki Haley is screaming bloody murder at the UN. Saying we need to investigate Nicaragua and stuff. I mean, Daniel, how do you see that sort of angle panning out? Because clearly, as you said, I mean, there are still some pockets within Nicaragua that are, I guess, still sort of actively protesting violently against the government. But, to a large degree, that's sort of quieted down. How do you see the sort of, Washington UN machinations playing out in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so the game plan that you mentioned, that's taking place in Nicaragua, Iran, this is an old game plan that the U.S. has played to effectuate regime change, really dating back to the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953, which the U.S. orchestrated. And as you say, what happens is the U.S. Supports, and in some cases instigates, street protests, some of which are violent, and frankly hoping that the government cracks down on those protests, and then they can blame the government for that crackdown. And they combine this with economic sanctions and embargoes, which cripple the economy of the targeted country, causing more protests, and undermining, the government and economy so much that, at least they hope, there will be some sort of overthrow of the government. Clearly, if we look at Nicaragua, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Sandinista government when it's been in power. It's been trying to overthrow it, since the revolution happened in 1979. That's no secret. The U.S. has been very open about that, and it's open about it now. And the U.S. will not give up trying to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. I think you will see further sanctions against Nicaragua. Their economy is, while it's been growing since Ortega was elected in 2007, is a pretty fragile economy. It's a small economy. It's a small country, and it's the second poorest in Latin America and has been for a long time. It's not hard to cripple an economy like that of Nicaragua. They don't have a lot of natural resources. And so they're going to run the game plan of really what they did in, up to 1990. They're going to try to exhaust the population and force a change in regime. And there's many sad parts to this tale, but one sad part is that by all accounts, Nicaragua is the only country of the Central American countries that suffered war in the 80s that has not been sending migrants to the U.S. border, because it's been a very stable country, right? So while Nicaragua has not been sending migrants, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, other countries that suffered U.S.-backed aggression in the 80s, have been sending these migrants to the U.S. border, because these continue to be unstable countries and violent countries, largely due to years and years of U.S. intervention in those countries. Nicaragua, meanwhile, has been stable enough and prosperous enough for people not to want to flee to the United States. And so now it looks like the U.S. is going to change that. It seems dead set on making sure that now Nicaragua will have an immigration crisis. And it's just, to me, it's just so baffling, but also disheartening. I mean, just to see the U.S. stir up these troubles for these countries in this way, and the word that's often used, again, openly by the U.S. in terms of its goals in these countries is destabilization. The U.S. goes out of its way to destabilize a country. Think about that.
Yes.
No one wants instability, right? People fear that. All of us want to go about our lives in a peaceful way, being able to be prosperous, make a living, go home, and enjoy the safety of our homes. No one wants instability, and yet the U.S. is very open about the fact that it wants to spread instability throughout the world, particularly in countries that it is determined are too independent for their own good and for our own good. So that is certainly the game plan in Nicaragua, to destabilize that country. It's been working in the last several months. It seems to have run out of steam, that plan, for the moment, but I've no doubt the U.S. will continue in its destabilization efforts, much to the detriment of the Nicaraguan people and the people throughout the region.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to this, what you were saying before about creating a refugee problem or something, and it's so insidious. Because, and I think sometimes this argument can be a little overblown, but in general, the countries in Central America that are, trying to cross the U.S. border, as you rightfully point out, are all countries that the U.S. has intentionally tried to screw up and, destroy. And, it's so, I don't know, it's just so perverted that they're going to do that with Nicaragua, and then of course, turn around and blame them, for all of the ills of America. It's every time, an illegal immigrant commits a crime in America, it's just fuel for the fire. We need to build that wall. They can't be trusted. All of this intensely racist, bigoted rhetoric just becomes more and more amplified. And again, it's the easiest way to stop that is to stop messing with their economy and stop funding, almost exclusively right-wing groups to bring about a violent overthrow of of, the few independent leftist governments that are left in the region. And this is it's just so, I don't know, it's so perverse. And again, for so many of the right wingers here in the U.S. to not see this for what it is. Again, too, because this is a game plan, as you pointed out earlier, that we've used over and over again. And it's just very insidious and a very nasty way of doing business. Again, too, because it turns so many people here, into these bigoted, horrible people. And they, of course, will also be exploited. The racists are being exploited in America, to achieve all sorts of other political ends. I mean, it's horrible, like on all, on all sides of this. Very briefly though, Daniel, I just wanted to ask you, in Nicaragua specifically, are there any traces of the sort of right-wing Somoza dynasty that are still active? I mean, and what is the right wing in Nicaragua at the moment? I mean, we were recently talking on the show about Venezuela, and it's very easy to kind of pinpoint the main right-wing figures there. But what are the right-wing figures in Nicaragua? And also, are there any other, local actors that are participating in this? I mean, my initial thought always goes to Colombia, which is this haven for, U.S.-backed right-wing groups and stuff. I mean, do we see any of that? Any actors around Nicaragua? I mean, I know in the 80s, for instance, I mean, Costa Rica housed a lot of the Contras and was very favorable towards them. So is there anything like that at play right now?
Well, there are obviously indigenous forces in Nicaragua that are stirring up the pot. So first of all, again, a little background is that Ortega was very savvy when he was reelected president in 2007 after the long hiatus from 1990 to 2006. And he formed a tripartite system of policy making, and this included the government, labor unions, and the business community, and also to some extent the Catholic Church. And he tried to work with all these groups and get acceptance from all these groups to move forward with economic policies and poverty reduction. And that worked pretty well, again, up until mid-April. And what has happened since mid-April is that the business community, or at least large sectors of it, are part of the groups that are calling for Ortega to step down, as is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church played a very treacherous role, at least the hierarchy of the church, during these months. So one thing they did, the church purported to be the, host or essentially of the peace talks to end the crisis shortly after it began. The church was going to be the intermediary to help solve this crisis. But what became apparent, and what happened, and the Nicaraguans saw this before their eyes, because the church also insisted that the peace dialogue be put on TV, which was a mistake ultimately from their perspective, because what became apparent was that the church had no desire at all to make peace, but wanted to actually derail the peace dialogue in favor, again, of trying to push Ortega out. And this became very clear from the televised peace discussions. And so the church actually has lost a lot of credibility over these months because of that. So you have the church, you have the business community or some parts of the business community, and you certainly have other people. I mean, you mentioned, are there Somoza holdovers? I mean, what you certainly have a lot of ex-Contras who live in Nicaragua. You know, the war didn't end that long ago.
Right.
It ended in 1990. I mean, for some of us, that's like yesterday, you know. And so you certainly do still have folks who have hard feelings from that period, that certainly participated in some of the violence over the past months. And again, that the U.S. is happy to partner with to try to, you know, work its regime change plans in Nicaragua.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and move on to another country within the region, Venezuela, which I know you also have done a lot of work on. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit, only because we were recently discussing this assassination attempt on Maduro. You know, many people, you know, a bunch of prominent politicians in the opposition have been arrested in connection with this. And I wanted to I guess first get your take on what's going on right now, and you know, is there anything new that in regards to this assassination attempt that the listener should be aware of?
Well, in terms of the assassination attempt, I mean, clearly, first of all, there was an assassination attempt, and I emphasize that because the press, you know, immediately said that there was an alleged assassination attempt, right? They wouldn't even give Maduro the benefit of being a victim of an assassination attempt. These were all alleged attempts.
I want to jump in. I mean, there was a brief period where you had journalists and outlets here in the West, in the U.S. and the West in general, saying that there was no attack, that it was all fake, until people started showing videos of these drones exploding.
Right. Yeah. So again, the news is so politicized that they can't even at least acknowledge that Maduro survived what was a real assassination attempt. I have seen some reportage that maybe one of the drones was being directed from Miami, but I don't know for sure. I think we're still waiting for details on this, but certainly the people who participated in this plot have been egged on by the United States, by people like Marco Rubio, who's been very open about wanting regime change and expressing willingness for the U.S. to intervene to make it happen. Trump himself, we know, has articulated the desire for an armed intervention in Venezuela. So, there's certainly a lot of support in the halls of our leadership in the U.S. For some sort of armed intervention against Venezuela, and I think we saw some of that bear fruit with this attempt. What else is happening there is that in July of 2017, Trump really went after Venezuela with very, very devastating sanctions against their economy, against their oil industry, and it's really caused a lot of suffering for Venezuela. And they've entered a very difficult economic period, and of course, as part of the game plan, Venezuela is blamed for all of those problems that have resulted from these sanctions. Meanwhile, the government of Venezuela has tried to make adjustments to fight the sanctions and to get their economy back in order. They've introduced a new currency that is backed by the Petro, which is their cyber currency, which itself is backed by their oil. And their hope is to get inflation under control and get the economy moving again. There's some evidence that that's happening, and then in fact people who have left Venezuela are returning to Venezuela now with the hopes that this is going to work. But it's going to be an uphill battle because of the sanctions. It will be very hard for Venezuela to dig themselves out of this crisis. And I saw a headline yesterday saying that, the next 90 days in Venezuela would determine the direction of that country, which I think is right. If whether or not Venezuela can get their economy going again and overcome this problem of inflation and shortages, I think will determine whether they can do that pretty quickly will determine, where that country's headed. Of course, the U.S. hopes that Venezuela will not be able to overcome their economic woes, again, largely the result of these sanctions, and that the people will cry uncle and look for other leadership besides Maduro and the Socialist Party of Venezuela.
And Daniel, how do you see the Donald Trump and his sort of political rhetoric and his desire to go after people like Maduro? Unfortunately, and I myself am guilty of this, of sort of like neglecting the geopolitics of Latin America. We've become so obsessed, I think rightfully so in a lot of ways, in conflicts in the Middle East. I've covered Yemen, time and time again. Obviously, Syria, Afghanistan we're still fighting a war there. But, we tend to forget that the U.S., has always played a very, prominent role in all of Latin America. And for the most part right now, there's really only a handful of independent leaders left. You've got Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, you've got Maduro in Venezuela, but that's kind of it. Maybe there's a possibility with Obrador in Mexico that there might be some kind of slight change in terms of their more or less center-right government. But you see people like Lula in Brazil, being ousted. You've all over the rest of South America. These leaders are just sort of. Evo Morales, I guess, to an extent. But Correa in Ecuador was kicked out. So how do you see the current administration? Are we going to see more of a ramping up? I know that's a difficult question to try and answer, but there does seem to be a shift back towards these countries. We're seeing people like Marco Rubio openly talking about sending U.S. troops into Venezuela to take over the country because Venezuela poses a national security threat to America, which of course Rubio never explains beyond these vague allegations of drug trafficking and that Venezuela is harboring Hezbollah and ISIS, which makes zero sense, but that's for another day. How do you see the current administration and the current political climate in terms of what's going to be happening throughout Latin America?
Well, clearly, the Trump administration is going to be very aggressive in trying to destroy what is left of what they call the pink tide, which was this socialist movement throughout Latin America, which was very successful between about the year 2000 and 2010 or so. And then since that time, as you mentioned, one leader after another has been knocked off from power. You mentioned Brazil. U.S. prosecutors worked very closely with Brazilian prosecutors to go after President Dilma Rousseff, who was the successor to Lula. She was impeached in that process. And then, as you mentioned, Lula himself, who has massive support of the population. You know, I've seen polls where he's polling at like 80% or whatever. He's now in jail, again, largely because of machinations of the United States. And he was at one time, when he was president, at one point, Time magazine ranked him the most influential leader in the world. And now he's sitting in a jail in Brazil with presidential elections coming up. The UN has concluded that Lula has every right to run for a presidential election, and he would win. If he were allowed to run, he'd even win from jail. But it's not clear whether Brazil will allow him to run. Of course, you had the death of Chavez in 2013, which was quite devastating to the whole project. In Latin America, I mean, Chavez in his election in 1998 really began the pink tide movement in Latin America, which again would see Ortega reelected later, would see Evo Morales elected in Bolivia, who's now a target of the U.S., would see Rafael Correa elected. He's now being attacked by his successor. Would see Cristina elected in Venezuela, but most of these, you know, of the pink tide has been rolled back, and I think the U.S. smells blood in the water now, and they see three countries that they can really attack, and that's Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And so I think they will try to destroy what is left of that left-wing movement in Latin America. I mean, the irony of ironies was that the pink tide movement happened for the most part during the George W. Bush years. And the reason that was so is because he was too busy worried about the Middle East. I mean, yes. He just didn't have the bandwidth to worry about Latin America. Latin America is best off when the U.S. just forgets it's even there, right? Because the Monroe Doctrine is still very much in force. The U.S. still views Latin America as its backyard that it can intervene in anytime it wants. And really starting with Obama and increasing under Trump, the U.S. began to, put its sights once more on Latin America, much to its detriment.
Professor Daniel Kovalik, we've got just about a minute left, and I just wanted to hand it over to you. I wanted to thank you so much for joining us, but tell the listeners where they can go to find your work and about your books.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I write a lot for Counterpunch. People can check that out online, counterpunch.org. As you mentioned, I have two books that have been published by Skyhorse Publishing, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia and The Plot to Attack Iran. You can buy those pretty much wherever books are sold, Barnes & Noble, either online or at Barnes & Noble stores, at most independent bookstores, and on Amazon. And I have a third book coming out very shortly, The Plot to Control the World, about U.S. intervention in the last century. So, hopefully people will go and check that out.
Well, absolutely, and I highly encourage everyone to check out Daniel's work at Counterpunch and also his books, and I'd love to get you back on the show again soon to discuss more about Latin America, and certainly when your new book comes out. But Daniel Kovalik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you out there for listening to the show and for subscribing. And of course, if you want to support my work, then please go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond and become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. Well, thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be talking to you very soon.
No rules. No rules. No taboo topics. No taboo topics. No fear of doom. No fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.
Have you experienced the miracle of CBDs? They can help you reduce suffering, reduce stress, help you sleep better, modulate inflammation in the body, and is absolutely safe. Meta Hemp Solutions offers a radically innovative approach to CBDs for exceptional results. Stop suffering and reduce your stress now. Isn't it time for a good night's sleep? Stop worrying about tomorrow today. Lab tested for potency, purity, and is non-psychoactive. Free shipping to all 50 states. Try our product risk-free. Money-back guarantee. Use code AFR15 to get 15% off. That's Alpha Foxtrot Romeo 15 to get 15% off. Offer ends soon, so visit MetaHemp Solutions today at metahempsolutions.com or call 833-858-7500. Suffer no more. Get rid of the stress and sleep better. Get our product now at metahempsolutions.com. That's metahempsolutions.com.
We all know that they're not telling us the truth. So stand up for your rights, demand the real medicine, and your right to use it and grow it. This is Rick Sensen, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
When the weapons of mass destruction thing turned out not to be true, I expected the American people to rise up. They didn't. Then, when the Abu Ghraib torture thing surfaced, and it was revealed that our government participated in rendition, a practice where we kidnap people and turn them over to regimes who specialize in torture, I was sure then the American people would be heard from. We stood mute. Then came the news that we jailed thousands of so-called terrorist suspects, locked them up without the right to a trial or even the right to confront their accusers. Certainly, we would never stand for that. We did. And now it's been discovered the executive branch has been conducting massive, illegal domestic surveillance on its own citizen. You and me. And I at least consoled myself that finally, the American people will have had enough. Evidently, we haven't. In fact, if the people of this country have spoken the messages, we're okay with it all. Torture, warrantless search and seizures, illegal wiretappings, prison without a fair trial, or any trial, war on false pretenses. We as a citizenry are apparently not offended. There are no demonstrations on college campuses. In fact, there's no clear indication that young people even seem to notice. The Secret Service can now declare free speech zones to contain, control, and in effect, criminalize protest. If you have on a supportive t-shirt, you can be there. If you're wearing or carrying something in protest, you can be removed. This in the United States of America. This in the United States of America. Every time somebody disagrees with how the government is running things, he or she is labeled un-American. The tragedy of our day is the climate of fear in which we live, and fear breeds repression. It's far easier to fight for principles than to live up to them.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio and service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5. Roger, copy. 3. 2. 1. Engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.